The sea was black beneath them. Not blue, not silver, black. It rose in walls beneath the Spanish ships, lifted entire galleons toward the sky, and then dropped them into valleys of foam. Men clung to ropes with bleeding hands. Cannons tore loose from their mountings. Masts cracked like trees in a storm. Somewhere beyond the rain, the English fleet was still hunting them. But by now, the English were no longer Spain's greatest enemy. The ocean itself had turned against the empire. It was the summer of 1588. King Philip II of Spain had sent one of the most famous fleets in history toward England. The Armada was meant to carry the strength of the world's most powerful monarchy across the Channel, protect an invasion army, overthrow a Protestant queen, and restore Catholic rule. Instead, battered ships were fleeing north around Scotland and Ireland, unable to return through the waters they had entered. Many crews were starving. Fresh water was disappearing. Disease spread below deck. And when the surviving vessels reached the Atlantic coast of Ireland, more storms drove some of them onto rocks. Wood shattered. Men drowned within sight of land. Others struggled ashore only to be captured or killed. The Armada had not been completely destroyed in battle. Its defeat was more complicated than the legend. Spain would send powerful fleets again. Its empire would continue to expand. But something had changed. For the first time, the great machine looked vulnerable. The monarchy that claimed lands across oceans had discovered that distance could become a weapon. The silver that paid soldiers could also attract pirates. The faith that united kingdoms could also divide Europe. And the empire that seemed too large to defeat could become too large to control. Yet the real mystery of the Spanish Empire is not that it eventually declined. Every empire declines. The mystery is how a collection of kingdoms on the edge of Europe built the first truly global imperial system in history. A system that connected the mines of the Andes to the markets of China. A system that carried horses, wheat, sugar, guns, books, diseases, missionaries, enslaved people, and royal orders across the Atlantic and Pacific. A system that destroyed civilizations, absorbed cultures, created new societies, and reshaped the languages and beliefs of hundreds of millions of people. Spain did not simply conquer territory. It helped create the modern world. And the price of that creation was paid by people whose names rarely appeared in royal chronicles. Indigenous farmers forced into mines. African captives carried across the ocean. Sailors who vanished at sea. Women who held families and businesses together in cities built far from Spain. Native allies who made Spanish victories possible, then discovered that victory did not mean equality. Priests who defended indigenous communities. Priests who burned sacred objects. Conquistadors who became legends. And rulers who sat in distant palaces, trying to govern places they would never see. To understand how this happened, we have to return to a time before Spain was an empire. Before the galleons. Before the Silver Mountain. Before the word America meant what it means today. We have to return to a peninsula divided by language, law, religion, dynasty, and memory. For centuries, the Iberian Peninsula had been a frontier between Christian and Muslim powers. That simple description hides a far more complicated world. There were wars, but also trade. There was persecution, but also long periods of coexistence. Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities lived beside one another, sometimes peacefully, sometimes under pressure, always influencing the languages, architecture, agriculture, science, and culture of the peninsula. The Christian kingdoms in the north gradually expanded southward in a process later called the Reconquista. But this was not one continuous national crusade lasting hundreds of years. It was a shifting series of wars, alliances, marriages, betrayals, and negotiations. Christian rulers fought other Christian rulers. Muslim rulers allied with Christian kings against Muslim rivals. Territory changed hands more than once. The peninsula was not moving toward a future everyone could already see. It was being shaped by decisions made in uncertainty. By the 15th century, two crowns had become especially powerful. Castile dominated much of the center and west. Aragon controlled territories along the Mediterranean and possessed interests in Italy. In 1469, Isabella of Castile married Ferdinand of Aragon. The marriage did not instantly create a unified Spanish nation. Castile and Aragon kept separate laws, institutions, currencies, and political traditions. But the union joined two dynasties whose combined power would transform Europe. Isabella and Ferdinand faced civil conflict, rebellious nobles, financial weakness, and the challenge of establishing stronger royal authority. They were not beginning with unlimited power. They had to build it. They formed alliances with towns. They reorganized royal councils. They strengthened institutions that could carry their orders beyond the court. They brought powerful nobles closer to royal control while still depending on aristocratic support. And they made religion central to monarchy. In 1478, the Spanish Inquisition was authorized. Its purpose was to investigate baptized Christians suspected of secretly practicing Judaism or Islam, though its reach and targets changed over time. The Inquisition became a symbol of religious fear and state power. It also reflected a deeper anxiety within the monarchy. The rulers wanted unity, but they ruled societies shaped by diversity. The more they tried to create a single religious identity, the more suspicion entered everyday life. Then came 1492. Few years in European history carry so many consequences. In January, the last Muslim-ruled kingdom on the peninsula, Granada, surrendered to Ferdinand and Isabella. The ceremony was carefully staged. Banners rose above the Alhambra. Crosses replaced the symbols of the defeated Nasrid dynasty. The monarchs presented the victory as the completion of a sacred mission. But for the people of Granada, the future was uncertain. The surrender agreements initially promised protections for Muslim religion and property. Over time, many of those protections were broken. Pressure to convert increased. Rebellion followed. Forced conversion created communities officially Christian but still treated with suspicion. These converts and their descendants would become known as Moriscos. More than a century later, they would be expelled from Spain. In that same year, 1492, the monarchy ordered the expulsion of practicing Jews who refused baptism. Jewish families who had lived in Iberia for generations were forced to choose exile or conversion. They carried their language, knowledge, commercial connections, memories, and grief across the Mediterranean, into North Africa, the Ottoman world, Italy, and beyond. The monarchy had one Granada, but unity was being built through exclusion. And while one world was closing inside Iberia, another was about to open across the Atlantic. Christopher Columbus was not the first European to reach the Americas. Norse voyagers had crossed the North Atlantic centuries earlier. And of course, the lands Columbus reached were already home to millions of people, with cities, states, trade networks, agriculture, religions, diplomatic traditions, and histories of their own. But Columbus's voyage created a permanent connection between the Atlantic worlds. That connection would become catastrophic, profitable, violent, creative, and irreversible. Columbus believed he could reach Asia by sailing west. He underestimated the size of the Earth and did not know that two vast continents stood between Europe and the markets he hoped to reach. For years, he searched for support. Portugal rejected his plan. Advisors in Castile doubted his calculations. But after the conquest of Granada, Ferdinand and Isabella approved the expedition. 3 ships sailed from Palos in August 1492, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. For the sailors, the ocean seemed endless. Every day westward increased the distance from everything familiar. They watched birds. They studied floating plants. They searched the horizon for signs of land. Fear grew. Then, in October, land appeared. Columbus had reached an island in the Bahamas. He believed he was near Asia. The people who met him were Taino. They lived in a Caribbean world of islands connected by travel, kinship, trade, conflict, and culture. Columbus saw generosity. He also saw opportunity. In his descriptions, curiosity quickly became calculation. How many could be converted? What gold might exist nearby? How easily could these people be controlled? The first encounter already contained the pattern that would follow. Europeans entered indigenous worlds they barely understood, interpreted them through their own ambitions, and claimed authority they did not possess. Columbus returned to Spain with news that seemed miraculous. He carried indigenous captives. He displayed unfamiliar objects. He promised wealth. The royal court moved quickly. Spain and Portugal were already competing for Atlantic expansion. Portugal had spent decades developing routes along the coast of Africa, building trade networks, and searching for a sea route to Asia. Now Castile had crossed the Western Ocean. The two powers needed a line. In 1494, The Treaty of Tordesillas divided newly claimed lands outside Europe along an imaginary boundary in the Atlantic. Spain received rights to lands west of the line. Portugal received rights to lands east. No indigenous nation had been consulted. No African ruler had agreed. No Asian kingdom recognized the authority behind the decision. Two European monarchies had attempted to divide much of the unknown world between them. It was an extraordinary act of confidence, and it revealed the central illusion of empire. A claim on paper was not the same as control. Spain would spend centuries trying to turn lines on maps into obedience on the ground. Columbus returned to the Caribbean with a much larger expedition. This time, the goal was not exploration alone. It was colonization. Settlers came with animals, tools, seeds, weapons, and expectations. They wanted gold. They wanted land. They wanted status. They wanted rewards for crossing the ocean. But the Caribbean did not provide wealth in the way many imagined. Gold existed, but not in unlimited quantities. Food supplies failed. Settlers became sick. Leadership collapsed into conflict. And Spanish demands fell with increasing violence on Taino communities. The colonists imposed tribute. They seized labor. They punished resistance. They took captives. The encomienda system granted colonists the right to receive tribute and labor from designated indigenous communities, supposedly in exchange for protection and Christian instruction. In practice, it frequently became a structure of coercion and abuse. The language of duty hid the reality of extraction. A man could say he was saving souls while forcing bodies to work. A crown could issue laws against mistreatment while continuing to benefit from the system that produced it. The Spanish monarchy did not always approve of everything colonists did. Royal officials often feared that conquistadors and settlers would become too powerful. The crown tried to regulate conquest, labor, and conversion. It sent judges. It issued decrees. It heard complaints. But the Atlantic was wide. Orders took months to arrive. Local officials were often tied to the same interests they were supposed to control. And by the time justice crossed the ocean, entire communities could already be gone. Disease accelerated the destruction. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other illnesses carried from the Old World struck populations with no previous exposure and no inherited immunity to those particular diseases. Epidemics did not act alone. They spread through societies already disrupted by war, hunger, forced labor, displacement, and political breakdown. The result was one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in human history. The Caribbean became the first laboratory of Spanish Empire. It was where colonists learned methods they would carry to the mainland. It was where the monarchy developed institutions for ruling across the ocean. It was where indigenous resistance met European weapons, alliances, and disease. And it was where the dream of easy wealth first revealed its human cost. Among the colonists who witnessed these events was Bartolomé de las Casas. He had once benefited from the colonial system. Then he became one of its most famous critics. Las Casas argued that indigenous peoples were rational human beings with rights, capable of accepting Christianity without force. He described cruelty in language designed to shock the conscience of Europe. His writings influenced debates at the Spanish court and contributed to reforms, including the new laws of 1542, which attempted to limit the inheritance and abuses of encomiendas. But Las Casas was also a man of his time, and some of his earlier proposals regarding African labor would later be deeply regretted by him. The debate around indigenous rights did not make the empire humane, but it mattered. It revealed that Spain's conquests were never morally uncontested, even within Spain. The empire produced defenders, critics, theologians, lawyers, officials, and missionaries who argued over the legitimacy of conquest. Could a Christian monarch rule people who had never accepted his authority? Could war be justified in the name of conversion? Were indigenous states lawful political communities? Did natural rights belong to all human beings? These questions were discussed in universities and councils while violence continued in the Americas. That contradiction would define the Spanish Empire. It could generate legal arguments of remarkable sophistication and still fail to protect the people discussed in those arguments. It could condemn cruelty in theory and reward conquest in practice. It could call indigenous people subjects of the crown and still treat their labor as a resource. But the Caribbean was only the beginning. Across the water, rumors grew of powerful mainland civilizations. cities richer than anything found on the islands, markets filled with goods, rulers who commanded armies, temples rising above lakes and valleys. The Spanish had been searching for gold. What they were about to find was an empire, and conquering it would require far more than a few hundred European soldiers. In 1519, Hernán Cortés sailed from Cuba toward the coast of Mexico. He did not arrive as the commander of a vast royal army. He led a relatively small expedition of soldiers, sailors, horses, cannon, and ambition. His authority was disputed from the beginning. The governor of Cuba had tried to remove him from command. Cortés sailed anyway. He was not simply carrying out a clear national plan. He was gambling. If he failed, he could be condemned as a rebel. If he succeeded, he might become one of the richest and most powerful men in the New World. On the coast, the Spanish encountered communities shaped by the power of the Mexica, the people often called the Aztecs. The Mexica capital, Tenochtitlan, stood on islands in Lake Texcoco. Causeways linked it to the shore. Canals crossed its neighborhoods. Aqueducts brought fresh water. Temples rose above crowded plazas. Its markets astonished European observers. The city was the center of a tribute empire built through warfare, diplomacy, intimidation, and alliance. It was powerful, but it was not loved by everyone it ruled. That weakness would become the opening Cortés needed. One of the most important people in the conquest was an indigenous woman known by several names, including Malintzin, Dona Marina, and La Malinche. She spoke languages that allowed her to help bridge communication between the Spaniards and Mesoamerican peoples. She became translator, advisor, negotiator, and intermediary. Later generations would argue over her memory. Some would call her a traitor. Others would see a woman surviving within forces she did not create. The truth cannot be reduced to a simple label. She had been enslaved before she entered Cortés's expedition. Her choices were made inside a world of danger, coercion, and rapidly changing power. Without interpreters like Malintzin, the Spaniards could not have understood alliances, rivalries, tribute demands, or political messages. Conquest depended on language before it depended on canon. Cortés founded Veracruz and used the new settlement to claim direct loyalty to the Spanish crown. It was a legal maneuver as much as a military one. By creating a town whose council recognized his authority, he tried to escape the control of Cuba's governor. Then he moved inland. The journey brought fighting, negotiation, and a crucial alliance with Tlaxcala. The Tlaxcalans were not passive helpers in a European conquest. They were an independent people with their own political goals and a long conflict with the Mexica. They initially fought the Spaniards. Then they chose alliance. Thousands of indigenous warriors would join the campaign. Other communities would also support the coalition against Tenochtitlan. This is one of the most important facts in the history of the conquest. The Mexica Empire was not defeated by Spaniards alone. It was defeated by a broad indigenous-led coalition in which the Spaniards played a dangerous and highly visible role. The weapons mattered. Steel swords cut differently from obsidian blades. Crossbows and firearms frightened opponents, though early guns were slow and unreliable. Horses gave mobility and shock. Cannons could break formations and defenses. But none of these advantages made a small Spanish force invincible. The invaders could be surrounded. They could run out of food. They could be killed. Their survival depended on local allies, supplies, intelligence, and political division. As Cortés approached Tenochtitlan, messengers moved between him and the Mexica ruler Moctezuma II. Later stories would claim that Moctezuma believed Cortés was a god. The evidence is far less certain. The idea may have grown from European interpretations and later narratives. Moctezuma was an experienced ruler facing an unfamiliar threat. He used diplomacy, gifts, delay, and observation. He may have hoped to understand the strangers, control them, or persuade them to leave. But the gifts of gold had the opposite effect. They confirmed that greater wealth existed ahead. When the Spanish and their allies entered Tenochtitlan in November 1519, they walked into one of the greatest cities on earth. They were guests. They were also potential hostages. Cortés soon seized Moctezuma and ruled through him. It was an astonishing act of nerve, and it placed everyone in danger. Tension filled the city. Then Cortés learned that a force from Cuba had landed to arrest him. He left Tenochtitlan to confront it, defeated the expedition, and persuaded many of its soldiers to join him. But while he was away, violence exploded in the capital. During a religious festival, Spanish forces under Pedro de Alvarado attacked Mexican nobles and participants. The massacre triggered rebellion. The city rose against the occupiers. When Cortés returned, the Spanish position was collapsing. Moctezuma died during the crisis. Accounts differ over exactly how. Spanish sources claimed he was struck by stones thrown by his own people after trying to calm them. Other traditions accused the Spaniards of killing him. What is certain is that his authority was gone. The invaders had lost control. On a rainy night in June 1520, the Spaniards and their allies tried to escape Tenochtitlan along the causeways. They carried gold. Too much gold. Some loaded themselves so heavily that when they fell into the water, the treasure pulled them down. Mexico warriors attacked from canoes and rooftops. Bridges were broken. Men, horses, weapons, and stolen wealth vanished into the lake. The retreat became known to the Spaniards as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. For the Mexica, it was a victory. Cortés had escaped, but his army had been shattered. The conquest could have ended there. But then came the force no general commanded. Smallpox entered the region. The epidemic killed across central Mexico, weakening communities, disrupting leadership, and spreading fear. Among the dead was the Mexica ruler Cuitlahuac, who had led resistance after Moctezuma. He was succeeded by Cuauhtémoc. The young ruler inherited a city threatened by disease, blockade, and an expanding enemy coalition. Cortés rebuilt his forces in Tlaxcala. He constructed brigantines that could be carried in pieces and assembled on the lake. He gathered tens of thousands of indigenous allies. Then the coalition returned. The siege of Tenochtitlan was brutal. The attackers cut aqueducts. They fought along causeways and canals. They destroyed buildings to prevent ambushes. Hunger spread inside the city. Disease continued to kill. Bodies filled the streets and water. Still, the defenders resisted. They fought district by district. The city did not fall because its people surrendered at the sight of Europeans. It fell after months of siege against an enormous coalition, under the pressure of epidemic and starvation. In August 1521, Cuauhtémoc was captured while trying to escape across the lake. The city was in ruins. On those ruins, the Spaniards would build Mexico City. Temples were dismantled. Stones from indigenous sacred buildings were used in churches and colonial structures. The new capital was meant to declare that one world had replaced another. But replacement was never complete. Nahuas continued to speak their languages, hold land, bring lawsuits, preserve local governments, create records, adapt Christian forms, and remember the past. Indigenous nobles negotiated positions within the new order. Tlaxcalans received privileges for their service, but also faced the growing demands of colonial rule. Communities that had helped defeat the Mexica discovered that Spain had not come to restore their freedom. It had come to establish sovereignty. The conquest spread outward through campaigns that lasted decades. Some regions resisted fiercely. The Maya world did not fall in one dramatic moment. Different Maya states confronted Spanish expansion over generations, and the last independent Maya kingdom was not conquered until the late 17th century. In northern Mexico, mobile and semi-settled peoples fought long wars against Spanish intrusion. In the south, unfamiliar terrain, distance, and determined resistance limited control. The map of New Spain could suggest complete domination. Reality was uneven. Spanish power was strongest in cities, mining zones, agricultural valleys, mission districts, and established routes. Beyond them lay frontiers where authority had to be negotiated every day. Yet even before Mexico had been fully subdued, new rumors were pulling Spaniards south. Stories told of another wealthy empire in the Andes. This empire was larger than the Mexica state. It stretched along mountains, valleys, deserts, and coasts. Its rulers commanded roads, storehouses, labor, armies, and a system of administration built across breathtaking terrain. It was called Tawantinsuyo, the realm of the four parts, the Inca Empire. And when the Spaniards arrived, it was already bleeding from within. The Inca ruler Huayna Capac had died, likely during an epidemic that reached the Andes before many Europeans did. A succession crisis followed. His sons Huáscar and Atahualpa fought a civil war. Armies marched across the empire. Cities changed hands. Elites chose sides. By the time Francisco Pizarro entered the region, Atahualpa had defeated Huáscar. He had won the empire, but the war had exhausted it. Pizarro's expedition was even smaller than the force Cortés first brought into Mexico. The Spaniards advanced into a political landscape they barely understood. They had experience from earlier conquests. They knew the value of surprise. They knew how to capture a ruler. They knew that an emperor could become a weapon against his own state. In November 1532, Atahualpa met the Spaniards at Cajamarca. He arrived with a vast following. The Spaniards waited concealed around the plaza. A friar approached the Inca ruler with a religious demand and a book. Accounts differ in detail, and later retellings often simplify the encounter. But the meeting ended in ambush. Cannons fired. Horses charged. Steel cut through a crowd trapped in the square. The Spaniards seized Atahualpa alive. It was the moment on which everything turned. An empire of millions had not been defeated in one afternoon, but its ruler had been captured by fewer than 200 invaders. Atahualpa understood that the Spaniards wanted precious metal. He offered a ransom that became legendary. A room filled with gold, 2 more with silver. Objects were gathered from across the empire. Sacred and artistic works were melted down. The metal lost its original form and became bars that could be divided. The ransom was paid. Atahualpa was not released. The Spaniards accused him of crimes, including conspiracy and idolatry. They executed him in 1533. The promise had never protected him. With Atahualpa dead, the Spaniards advanced toward Cusco. They elevated Inca rulers they hoped to control. They entered the capital and seized wealth. But occupation did not mean peace. Manco Inca, initially installed as a dependent ruler, rebelled. In 1536, his forces besieged Cusco and nearly drove out the Spaniards. The fighting was desperate. At the fortress of Sacsayhuaman, warriors battled over massive stone defenses above the city. Spanish survival was not guaranteed, but indigenous allies again played a decisive role. The Inca state had enemies and subject peoples with their own interests. The Spaniards used those divisions, just as they had in Mexico. Manco Inca eventually withdrew to Vilcabamba, where a Neo-Inca state survived for decades. The last ruler there, Tupac Amaru, was captured and executed in 1572. Even then, resistance did not disappear. In the Andes, memory could outlast armies. The conquest also produced war among the conquerors. Pizarro and Diego de Almagro had been partners. Then they became rivals over territory, wealth, and authority. Their factions fought. Almagro was executed. Pizarro was assassinated in Lima. The men who had helped destroy an empire turned their swords on one another. This violence exposed a problem for the crown. Conquistadors were useful when conquering. They were dangerous after victory. They expected land, labor, titles, and independence. The monarchy needed to prevent the new territories from becoming private kingdoms ruled by armed adventurers. So Spain transformed conquest into administration. Royal officials replaced some of the first conquerors. Viceroys arrived as representatives of the monarch. Audiencias acted as high courts and governing councils. Treasury officials counted royal revenue. Bishops and religious orders expanded the church. Municipal councils governed towns. Notaries recorded sales, marriages, wills, lawsuits, petitions, and disputes. Paper became one of the empire's most important tools. A conquest won by steel had to be maintained through documents. The Viceroyalty of New Spain was established in 1535. The Viceroyalty of Peru followed in 1542. From Mexico City and Lima, officials tried to govern territories larger than many European kingdoms combined. But they did not rule alone. Local indigenous communities retained institutions of their own. Native nobles served as intermediaries. Town councils included indigenous officials. Communities used Spanish courts to defend land, challenge abuses, and negotiate obligations. They could lose. They often did. But they were not silent. Colonial archives are filled with indigenous voices translated into the language of imperial law. The Spanish Empire was therefore not a simple pyramid with the king controlling every person beneath him. It was a web of bargains. The crown bargained with conquerors. Officials bargained with local elites. Missionaries bargained with communities. Merchants bargained with customs officers. Indigenous towns bargained over taxes and labor. Enslaved people bargained for time, family, freedom, or survival wherever the system allowed even the smallest opening. Everyone knew the monarchy was far away. That distance weakened the crown. It also allowed people to invoke the crown against local enemies. A colonist could claim royal authority while ignoring royal law. An indigenous petitioner could claim loyalty to the king while accusing a local Spaniard of injustice. The empire survived because different groups believed they could use it, and because those who could not use it were often forced to endure it. But administration alone could not explain Spain's sudden global power. The conquests had opened enormous territories. What transformed them into the financial heart of the monarchy was something hidden beneath the earth. Silver, not the gold of legends. Not jewels piled in a throne room. Silver in quantities the world had never seen. And high in the Andes, one mountain would become a symbol of wealth so immense that people said it could build a bridge across the Atlantic. The mountain was Cerro Rico. The city beneath it was Potosi, and its riches would help Spain rule the world while slowly poisoning the empire from within. Potosi rose more than 4,000 meters above sea level, in a landscape where the air was thin and the nights could be bitterly cold. Before the discovery of its great silver deposits, it was not a natural place for one of the largest cities in the Americas. There were no rich farmlands surrounding it. Food had to be carried in, would had to travel long distances. Animals struggled on the high plateau. Yet after 1545, people flooded toward the mountain. Spanish entrepreneurs came for fortunes. Indigenous workers came under obligation, pressure, or hope of wages. Merchants arrived with cloth, wine, tools, coca, candles, and luxury goods. Officials came to tax the wealth. Priests came to save souls. Gamblers, artisans, servants, mule drivers, enslaved Africans, widows, criminals, and adventurers followed. A city appeared where a city should not have been. At its height, Potosi became famous across the world. Its name entered language as a symbol of unimaginable riches. But the mountain did not give up silver willingly. Mining required tunnels cut into unstable rock, or had to be crushed. Silver had to be separated through complex processes that relied heavily on mercury. The work was dangerous above ground and worse below it. Dust entered lungs. Tunnels collapsed. Mercury poisoned bodies. Cold, exhaustion, and altitude weakened workers. Some entered the mountain and never returned. The Spanish crown revived and reorganized an Andean labor draft known as the Mita. Under colonial rule, communities were required to send a portion of their adult men to work in the mining economy, especially at Potosi. The system drew on older Inca traditions of labor service, but colonial demands transformed its scale and purpose. Families lost workers for months. Communities struggled to meet obligations. Some people fled their homes to escape registration. Others entered wage labor, trade, or transport around the mines. Colonial society was rarely divided into a simple line between forced labor and free labor. The two could exist together, tangled inside the same economy. The silver from Potosi was refined, stamped into bars or coins, taxed, transported across the Andes, carried to ports, and shipped toward Europe. Another stream came from the mines of New Spain, especially Zacatecas and later Guanajuato. Long roads formed around the silver economy. Mule trains crossed deserts and mountain passes. Forts and towns appeared along routes. Ranchers raised animals to feed mining settlements. Farmers expanded production. Merchants extended credit. The mine was not only a hole in the earth. It was the center of an entire colonial world. The crown claimed a share of precious metal, most famously through the royal fifth, though taxes and rates changed over time. Officials tried to record what was mined. Smugglers tried to hide it. Silver traveled legally in guarded fleets and illegally in secret cargoes. Some remained in the Americas. Some went to Spain. Much of it did not stay in Spain for long. This is where the Spanish Empire becomes a global story. The monarchy used American silver to pay soldiers in Europe, finance wars, service debts, and purchase goods. Foreign bankers extended loans against treasure expected from fleets that had not yet arrived. German, Genoese, and other financiers became essential to royal power. Merchants from across Europe sold Spain weapons, grain, textiles, ships, and manufactured goods. The silver entered their hands and moved outward. It crossed borders. It paid armies. It settled accounts. It flowed toward the markets of the Ottoman Empire, India, and China. China's enormous economy had a deep demand for silver, especially as taxation increasingly relied on it. Spanish-American metal became one of the major currencies of early global trade. A worker in the Andes could be forced to mine, or that would eventually help purchase silk in Manila. A merchant in Mexico City could invest in cargo from Asia. A Chinese porcelain bowl could cross the Pacific, travel overland through New Spain, cross the Atlantic, and enter a household in Europe. For the first time, a stable commercial network linked the Americas, Europe, Africa, and Asia on a planetary scale. This was not globalization in the modern sense. Travel remained slow, dangerous, and expensive, but the connections were real. A decision in one part of the empire could affect prices and lives thousands of miles away. And the key bridge across the Pacific was Manila. Spanish ambitions in Asia began with the search for the Spice Islands and a western route to Asian markets. Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese navigator sailing for Spain, led an expedition westward in 1519. His fleet crossed the Atlantic, found a passage through the southern tip of South America, and entered an ocean Europeans called Pacific because of its deceptive calm. The crossing became a nightmare. Food rotted. Men starved. Some ate leather and sawdust. The ocean was far larger than expected. Magellan reached the Philippines in 1521 but was killed at the Battle of Mactan after entering a local conflict against the forces of Lapu-Lapu. He did not complete the first circumnavigation. One surviving ship, commanded at the end by Juan Sebastián Elcano, returned to Spain in 1522. Of the hundreds who had set out, only a small fraction came home on that vessel. They had proved the oceans were connected. They had also revealed the cost of crossing them. Spain's permanent colonization of the Philippines began decades later. In 1565, an expedition under Miguel López de Legazpi established a foothold. In 1571, the Spanish founded Manila as their colonial capital in the islands. But the Philippines were never simply conquered as one unified territory. The archipelago contained many communities, languages, rulers, trade networks, and religious traditions. Spanish authority depended on alliances with local elites, military campaigns, missionary activity, and control of strategic centers. Muslim sultanates in the south resisted for centuries. Upland peoples often remained beyond effective colonial rule. Even near Spanish settlements, local life continued through negotiation and adaptation. Manila became the western anchor of the trans-Pacific galleon trade. From Acapulco in New Spain, ships carried silver across the Pacific. From Manila, they returned with silk, porcelain, spices, lacquerware, cotton textiles, ivory, and other Asian goods. Chinese merchants, often called Sanglis in Spanish records, were essential to the city's economy. They supplied food, crafts, trade goods, and commercial skill. They were also treated with suspicion. Spanish authorities feared their numbers and influence. Restrictions, expulsions, violence, and massacres scarred the history of Manila's Chinese community. The empire depended on people it refused to trust. That contradiction appeared everywhere. Spain needed indigenous labor, but feared indigenous rebellion. It needed foreign bankers, but resented foreign control of its finances. It needed local elites, but worried they would become independent. It needed merchants to evade rigid rules when the system failed, then punish them for smuggling. It needed diversity to function while proclaiming religious unity. The Manila Galleons were among the richest ships afloat. They were also floating prisons of risk. The crossing could take months. Storms scattered fleets. Disease spread in crowded holds. Navigation errors could condemn a ship to thirst. A single wreck could destroy fortunes built over years. Yet the profits were enormous enough that merchants kept trying. Silver from the Americas flowed west. Asian goods flowed east. Mexico stood between the oceans, becoming a hinge of the world economy. Goods landed at Acapulco, crossed New Spain, and continued from Veracruz toward Europe. People moved along the same routes. Filipinos reached Mexico. Mexicans reached Manila. Africans, Europeans, indigenous Americans, and Asians met in ports and markets where imperial categories blurred. The Spanish monarchy imagined separate kingdoms under one crown. The oceans created mixed worlds the monarchy could never fully organize. While these networks expanded, Spain itself was entering a new dynastic age. Ferdinand and Isabella's grandson Charles inherited an extraordinary collection of territories. He became King Charles I of Spain in 1516 and Holy Roman Emperor Charles V in 1519. His domains included Castile, Aragon, territories in Italy, the Burgundian Netherlands, Habsburg lands in Central Europe, and the expanding American possessions. He did not rule a single unified state. He ruled a composite monarchy. Each territory had its own laws, privileges, taxes, assemblies, and expectations. Charles had to negotiate with them all. His inheritance looked like power beyond imagination. It was also a trap. Every border created an enemy. Every title created an obligation. Every territory expected protection. France feared Habsburg encirclement. The Ottoman Empire expanded in the Mediterranean and Central Europe. Protestant reform shattered the religious unity of Western Christendom. German princes challenged imperial authority. Italian states became battlegrounds. The papacy shifted alliances. The Netherlands defended local privileges. And across the Atlantic, conquistadors expected rewards that the crown could not safely grant. Charles spent much of his reign moving from crisis to crisis. He fought Francis I of France repeatedly. At the Battle of Pavia in 1525, imperial forces captured the French king. It seemed like a spectacular victory. But victory did not end the rivalry. Wars resumed. In 1527, imperial troops, many unpaid and beyond control, sacked Rome. The city of the Pope was devastated by soldiers serving a Catholic emperor. That single event captured the chaos of Charles's world. Dynastic ambition, unpaid armies, religious loyalty, and political rivalry could collide until no one controlled the result. To the east, Ottoman power under Suleiman the Magnificent threatened Habsburg territories and dominated much of the Mediterranean struggle. Ottoman armies defeated Hungary at Mohacs in 1526. Vienna was besieged in 1529. In North Africa and at sea, Spanish and Ottoman forces competed through fortresses, fleets, corsairs, and alliances. The conflict was not a simple civilizational duel between Christianity and Islam. France, a Catholic kingdom, allied with the Ottomans against the Habsburgs. Muslim and Christian powers made practical agreements when strategy demanded it. Galley slaves of different faiths rode on both sides. Coastal populations suffered raids regardless of grand religious language. The Mediterranean frontier consumed money and men. Then Martin Luther's challenge to the church opened another crisis. Charles saw himself as defender of Catholic unity. But he could not reverse the Reformation by command. Many German princes adopted Lutheran ideas for reasons of belief, politics, property, and autonomy. Wars followed. Compromises failed. The empire Charles ruled was too diverse for the unity he imagined. Across the Atlantic, American silver seemed to offer an answer. More money could pay more troops. More fleets could defend more coasts. More credit could sustain more war. But silver did not remove the limits of power. It delayed them. The monarchy borrowed against future income. When revenues rose, lenders offered more credit. When expenses rose faster, the crown borrowed again. Spain became powerful enough to fight nearly everywhere, and therefore vulnerable to war nearly everywhere. The empire's wealth did not produce peace. It expanded the scale of its commitments. Inside Castile, the burden was especially heavy. Castile supplied much of the taxation and manpower for imperial policy. Other parts of the monarchy guarded their privileges and resisted new demands. This imbalance mattered. The American empire was often called Spanish, but much of its early administration and commerce belonged specifically to the Crown of Castile. Seville became the official gateway to the Indies. The Casa de Contratación regulated trade, trained pilots, gathered maps, registered passengers, and attempted to control the flow of goods. The Council of the Indies advised the monarch and produced laws for overseas government. In theory, the system was centralized. In reality, it survived through exceptions. Ships sailed late. Officials took bribes. Merchants used false records. Foreign goods entered through Spanish intermediaries. Colonists traded with one another despite restrictions. Smuggling became not merely a crime, but part of how the imperial economy functioned. The crown wanted control over oceans. No government could fully control oceans. To protect trade, Spain developed the fleet system. Merchant vessels sailed in convoys escorted by warships. One route served New Spain. Another served the Caribbean and South America. Havana became a gathering point before the dangerous return across the Atlantic. The fleets carried silver, dyes, sugar, hides, tobacco, and other goods. They brought European products and royal orders westward. They also carried news. A death at court, a declaration of war, a new tax, a papal decision, a rumor of pirates. Months could pass before a colony learned that its king had died. Empire lived in delayed time. This delay gave local officials freedom, but it also created fear. A governor could not know whether peace still existed in Europe. A ship approaching the horizon might be friendly, hostile, or infected. A treasure fleet might arrive and rescue royal finances, or it might disappear in a hurricane. Charles V eventually recognized that no one man could carry all his crowns forever. Exhausted by war, illness, and disappointment, he abdicated in stages during the 1550s. The Habsburg inheritance was divided. His brother Ferdinand received the imperial title and Central European Habsburg lands. His son Philip received Spain, the Netherlands, Italian territories, and the overseas empire. Philip II would rule from 1556 to 1598. He inherited the strongest monarchy in Europe. He also inherited its debts, enemies, religious wars, and impossible expectations. Philip was different from his father. Charles had traveled constantly. Philip governed increasingly from Spain. He built a court centered around documents, councils, reports, and memoranda. At El Escorial, the palace monastery complex outside Madrid, administration took on a monumental form. Paper flowed toward the king from every direction. Officials summarized reports. Councils debated. Secretaries carried decisions. Philip read, annotated, delayed, reconsidered, and demanded more information. He has often been portrayed as a ruler buried under paperwork while his empire moved too quickly for his pen. There is truth in the image. But the paperwork was not a sign of laziness. It was the technology of distant rule. The problem was that information could take a year to travel from Manila to Madrid and back. By the time an answer arrived, the situation might no longer exist. Philip believed deeply in his duty to defend Catholicism and royal authority. That conviction gave his reign purpose. It also made compromise difficult. In the Netherlands, disputes over taxation, local privileges, centralization, and religious persecution grew into revolt. The provinces were wealthy, urbanized, commercially dynamic, and protective of their traditions. Calvinism spread in parts of the region. Spanish repression, especially under the Duke of Alba, intensified resistance. Executions created martyrs. Taxes produced anger. War hardened identity. What began as rebellion became a struggle that would last for generations. Spain could win battles. It could capture cities. It could send experienced armies along the route later called the Spanish Road from Italy through Europe to the Low Countries. But it could not easily force permanent obedience on provinces supported by waterways, fortifications, commerce, and foreign allies. The Dutch revolt became a wound that consumed treasure year after year. Then, in 1571, Spain helped win one of the most celebrated naval victories of the age. At Lepanto, a Holy League fleet defeated the Ottoman navy in a massive galley battle. The clash was brutal and close. Cannons fired at short range. Soldiers boarded enemy vessels. Enslaved rowers struggled beneath decks as ships collided above them. Thousands died. The victory limited the immediate Ottoman threat in the Western Mediterranean and became a powerful symbol in Catholic Europe. But it did not end Ottoman power. The empire rebuilt its fleet. The Mediterranean struggle continued. Lepanto was a triumph. It was not a final answer. That pattern followed Philip everywhere. Victory created another obligation. Conquest created another border. And then, in 1580, a new crown fell into his hands. The King of Portugal died without a direct heir. Philip claimed the throne through his mother's line and used both negotiation and force to secure it. For 60 years, the crowns of Spain and Portugal were united under the same Habsburg monarchs. The two empires remained institutionally distinct, but their territories now belonged to one dynasty. From Brazil to Angola, from Mexico to Peru, from Goa to Macau, from Manila to the Atlantic Islands. The monarchy's reach became almost unimaginably broad. People later said it was an empire on which the sun never set. At any hour, daylight touched some territory ruled by Philip. This was the peak of appearance, and perhaps the beginning of the deepest danger. Because the larger the empire became, the more enemies could strike it. Dutch fleets attacked Portuguese possessions. English privateers raided Spanish trade. French rivals watched for weakness. Rebellion continued in the Netherlands. Every ocean became a battlefield. Every treasure ship became a target. And in England, a Protestant queen stood at the center of Philip's growing frustration. Her name was Elizabeth. The road to the Armada had begun. Elizabeth I had once been connected to Philip II by marriage politics. Philip had been married to her half-sister, Mary I of England. During Mary's reign, England returned officially to Catholicism, and Philip became king consort. But Mary died childless in 1558. Elizabeth took the throne. England became Protestant again. The relationship between the two monarchies slowly deteriorated. Religion was part of the conflict. So was trade. So was the Netherlands. So was piracy disguised as patriotism. English mariners such as Francis Drake attacked Spanish ports and shipping, often with support from investors close to the crown. To Spain, Drake was a pirate. To many in England, he was a hero. He raided the Caribbean, struck settlements, captured treasure, and completed a circumnavigation of the globe. The silver routes that made Spain powerful also showed its enemies exactly where to attack. A fleet carrying a year's wealth could be worth more than a city. Spain's empire had created concentrated targets moving across predictable oceans. Elizabeth also supported Dutch rebels resisting Philip. English aid did not cause the revolt, but it made the conflict more dangerous for Spain. Then came the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, in 1587. Mary was Catholic and had a claim to the English throne. Her death removed a possible alternative to Elizabeth and outraged Catholic Europe. Philip had already been considering invasion. Now preparations accelerated. The plan was vast. A fleet would sail from Spain into the English Channel. It would link with the Duke of Parma's army in the Netherlands. That army, one of the most experienced in Europe, would cross into England under naval protection. The invasion would defeat Elizabeth and change the balance of power. But the plan depended on timing, communication, weather, deep water ports, and cooperation between forces separated by hostile seas. It demanded precision from an age in which messages moved at the speed of horses and sailing ships. Before the Armada sailed, Drake attacked Cadiz in 1587, burning or capturing vessels and supplies. The English called it singeing the king of Spain's beard. The raid delayed preparations but did not stop them. In 1588, the Armada finally left. It consisted of around 130 ships of different types, carrying sailors, soldiers, guns, horses, priests, supplies, and the weight of royal expectation. Its commander, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, was a high noble and capable organizer, though he had not sought the command and was not the naval genius later legends demanded. The fleet's purpose was not simply to destroy the English navy. It had to control the channel long enough to escort Parma's army. That was the real challenge. The English fleet harassed the Armada as it moved up the channel. English ships were generally more maneuverable and preferred firing from a distance rather than closing for boarding. Spanish formation remained disciplined. The Armada was not immediately broken. It anchored near Calais to wait for contact with Parma. But Parma's troops were blocked by Dutch control of shallow coastal waters and lacked an easy way to join the fleet. Communication failed. Time disappeared. Then the English sent fireships into the anchorage. They were vessels set alight and allowed to drift toward the Spanish formation. Fear of explosion and collision forced Spanish captains to cut anchor cables and scatter. The next day, near Gravelines, the English attacked the disordered fleet. The battle damaged ships and exhausted ammunition. The Armada was pushed north. The route back through the channel was closed. Medina Sidonia made the only choice left. The fleet would sail around Scotland and Ireland, then return to Spain through the Atlantic. That was when storms, damaged hulls, sickness, poor charts, and failing supplies turned defeat into disaster. Ships were wrecked along unfamiliar coasts. Thousands died. Yet the Armada's failure did not instantly destroy Spanish sea power. This is where popular memory becomes misleading. Spain remained a formidable naval and imperial power after 1588. English counterattacks also failed. Spanish fleets continued to cross the Atlantic. The treasure system survived. The monarchy launched new armadas. But the invasion had failed, and the image of invincibility had cracked. For England and the Dutch rebels, the event became a national myth. For Spain, it became one more enormous expense in a reign already filled with war. Philip II died in 1598. He left an empire larger than the one he had inherited. He also left unresolved conflicts and a monarchy repeatedly forced to suspend payments on its debts. Royal bankruptcy did not mean the state had no wealth. It meant obligations had become impossible to meet on schedule. The crown renegotiated with lenders, converted short-term loans into longer arrangements, and continued. The empire did not collapse. It adapted, but every adaptation carried future cost. To understand why Spanish power lasted, we must leave the battlefield and enter the colonial city. Imagine Mexico City a century after the fall of Tenochtitlan. Church bells mark the day. Carriages pass through crowded streets. Indigenous vendors sell food in markets older than Spanish rule. African and mixed-race workers move goods from carts and canoes. Merchants calculate credit behind wooden counters. Nuns manage property from convents. Officials carry sealed documents. Students debate theology and law. Craftsmen produce furniture, silverwork, paintings, saddles, textiles, and religious images. The city is colonial. It is also indigenous. It is European, African, and increasingly something new. Spanish America did not become a copy of Spain. It developed societies shaped by conquest, but not reducible to conquest. Indigenous languages remained widely spoken. Nahuatl served as a language of administration and evangelization in parts of New Spain. Quechua and Aymara continued across the Andes. Missionaries produced grammars, dictionaries, sermons, and religious texts in local languages because conversion required communication. The same process that attacked indigenous religions sometimes preserved linguistic knowledge in written form. Churches rose over sacred sites, but indigenous artists carved, painted, built, and transformed them. European saints acquired local meanings. Christian festivals merged with community traditions. Music crossed cultures. Religious brotherhoods organized worship, mutual aid, and public identity. The crown and church wanted conversion. What emerged was not simply European religion transplanted intact. It was a range of colonial Christianities shaped by local people. This did not mean coercion disappeared. Missionaries destroyed sacred objects. Campaigns against idolatry investigated ceremonies and punished spiritual leaders. Communities were resettled into planned towns to make taxation, labor, and evangelization easier. In the Andes, these relocations were often called reductions. Moving people could break relationships with ancestral lands, water sources, burial places, and sacred landscapes. The colonial grid was not merely architecture. It was an attempt to reorganize life. Spanish cities were often laid out around a central plaza. The cathedral, government buildings, and elite houses occupied prominent positions. Straight streets suggested order. But beyond official plans, cities grew through markets, neighborhoods, informal settlements, workshops, and communities the planners had not imagined. The plaza displayed imperial authority. The streets revealed how limited that authority could be. Colonial society was deeply hierarchical. People were identified through birthplace, ancestry, legal status, occupation, reputation, wealth, language, and religion. Peninsulars were people born in Spain. Criollos were people of Spanish ancestry born in the Americas. Mestizo often referred to mixed indigenous and European ancestry. Mulatto commonly referred to mixed African and European ancestry. Other labels multiplied, especially in 18th century documents and paintings. But these categories were neither perfectly fixed nor consistently applied. A person's classification could change across records. Money, marriage, clothing, community recognition, occupation, and legal strategy could shape identity. The caste system was real as a structure of inequality. But it was not a simple scientific chart governing every human interaction. Life was more fluid than official categories suggested and more unequal than fluidity might imply. At the top stood royal officials, high clergy, major landowners, mine owners, and wealthy merchants. But even elites were divided. American-born Spaniards could resent appointments given to newcomers from the peninsula. Old conquistador families could lose wealth. Merchants could become richer than nobles. Indigenous nobles sometimes preserved status, land, and privileges unavailable to commoners. Free black and mixed-race people could own property, practice trades, serve in militias, and bring cases to court. Some enslaved people purchased freedom. None of this erased the violence of the system. It shows that colonial society was built through layers, not one line. African slavery became fundamental to many parts of the empire. As indigenous populations declined and colonial economies expanded, Spanish territories imported enslaved Africans through Atlantic networks often controlled in practice by Portuguese, Genoese, Dutch, French, or English merchants under contracts known as asientos. Captives were taken from different regions of Africa, carried to coastal forts, forced aboard ships, and transported through the Middle Passage. Many died before reaching the Americas. Those who survived were sold into lives they had not chosen. They worked in sugar plantations, mines, ranches, workshops, ports, households, construction, and urban trades. Their labor helped build imperial wealth. Their cultures helped build the Americas. Enslaved Africans and their descendants did not enter history only as victims. They formed families. They created religious communities. They preserved and transformed music, food, language, healing knowledge, and memory. They escaped. Runaway communities, often called palenques or maroon settlements, defended themselves beyond colonial control. They negotiated treaties. They joined militias. They sued owners. They bought freedom where possible. They rebelled. Every act of survival challenged the claim that one human being could completely own another. Sugar intensified slavery in the Caribbean. The crop demanded land, mills, capital, and exhausting labor. As global demand grew, islands became sites of extraordinary profit and suffering. Cuba would eventually become one of the great sugar producers of the 19th century, with an economy deeply tied to enslaved labor long after most of mainland Spanish America became independent. But even in earlier centuries, slavery connected Spanish colonies to the wider Atlantic system. The empire was Catholic in official identity, yet it depended on the sale of human beings. Again, belief and practice stood beside each other without resolution. Women lived at the center of colonial society, though formal power often excluded them. Elite marriages joined fortunes and political networks. Dowries transferred property. Widows could manage estates and businesses. Market women controlled essential trade. Indigenous women preserved community knowledge and family claims. African and mixed-race women worked as vendors, servants, artisans, healers, and property owners, whether free or enslaved. Convents offered some women education, status, religious vocation, and a life outside marriage, though entry often depended on class and ancestry. Nuns could become writers and intellectuals. The most famous was Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz in New Spain. A poet, scholar, and nun, Sor Juana defended women's capacity for learning in a society that restricted it. Her work became one of the great achievements of the Spanish Golden Age. That Golden Age was not limited to Europe. The wealth and networks of empire supported art, literature, architecture, theater, scholarship, and devotion across the Spanish world. In Spain, writers such as Miguel de Cervantes transformed literature. His Don Quixote told the story of a man trapped between heroic dreams and an ordinary world that refused to match them. It is difficult to imagine a more fitting book for imperial Spain. A monarchy living inside visions of universal mission while struggling with debt, corruption, hunger, and disappointment. Painters such as El Greco, Diego Velázquez, Francisco de Zurbarán, and Bartolomé Esteban Murillo created works of spiritual intensity and courtly power. Velázquez painted kings, princesses, servants, dwarfs, laborers, and mythological figures with a realism that made status feel both grand and fragile. In the Americas, artists combined European forms with indigenous and African materials, techniques, and symbols. Churches in Mexico, Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, and elsewhere became visual worlds of carved stone, gold leaf, painted angels, local plants, indigenous faces, and sacred drama. The art of empire proclaimed victory. It also recorded mixture. Universities were founded in the Americas early in the colonial period. Printing presses produced religious works, laws, poetry, histories, and scientific texts. Scholars studied plants, languages, stars, geography, and medicine. Indigenous authors created accounts that preserved perspectives ignored by Spanish chronicles. Felipe Guaman Poma de Ayala produced a vast illustrated work criticizing colonial abuses and explaining Andean society to the king. The document may never have reached the monarch, but it survived. Centuries later, its drawings still speak. They show officials, priests, workers, rulers, punishments, ceremonies, and everyday life. A subject at the edge of empire had addressed the center. The center had not listened. This was common. The Spanish crown issued laws intended to regulate treatment, preserve communities, and limit exploitation. The laws of the Indies became one of the largest bodies of colonial legislation in history. They governed town planning, trade, labor, conversion, offices, and relations with indigenous subjects. Some rules were protective. Some were controlling. Many were contradictory. The phrase often associated with colonial officials was, "I obey, but I do not comply." Whether spoken exactly as legend remembers or not, it captured a real habit. An official could recognize the king's command while delaying enforcement because local conditions supposedly made it impossible. Distance turned obedience into interpretation. This created space for corruption. It also created space for negotiation. The empire was strong because it could bend. It was weak because bending often became evasion. Beyond the great cities, frontiers remained violent and uncertain. In southern Chile, the Mapuche resisted Spanish expansion in the long Arauco War. They learned to use horses, adapted weapons and tactics, and defended political independence across generations. Spanish forces won battles, but could not easily conquer the region south of the Biobío River. The frontier became a zone of raids, trade, diplomacy, captivity, exchange, and war. The Mapuche did not survive because Spain ignored them. They survived because they fought, adapted, negotiated, and made conquest too costly. In northern New Spain, indigenous peoples resisted missions, settlements, labor demands, and military intrusion. Some groups moved across vast territories that Spanish officials could not control. Presidios and missions appeared as linked institutions of frontier rule. Soldiers defended settlers and routes. Missionaries attempted conversion and resettlement. But the mission frontier depended on supplies, local alliances, and indigenous participation. It could collapse when those disappeared. The most dramatic challenge in the northern borderlands came in 1680. Across New Mexico, Pueblo communities had endured religious repression, labor demands, violence, and pressure on their way of life. A leader remembered as Pepe helped organize a coordinated uprising. Runners carried knotted cords to participating communities, each not marking a day until revolt. The Spanish discovered part of the plan. The rebels moved early. Pueblo forces attacked missions and settlements. They cut roads and surrounded Santa Fe. The Spanish governor and survivors retreated south. For 12 years, Spanish rule disappeared from much of New Mexico. It was one of the most successful indigenous revolts against European colonial power in North American history. When the Spanish returned in the 1690s, they did so with military force, but also with greater caution in some religious and political practices. The revolt had proven something the empire never forgot. Colonized people were not simply waiting to become Spanish. They could coordinate across differences. They could expel priests and soldiers. They could reclaim sacred spaces. They could win. Other revolts erupted across the empire. Some were local protests against taxes or labor. Some were led by communities defending land. Some used the language of loyalty to the king while attacking corrupt officials. This was not hypocrisy. Many subjects believed the monarch might be just even when local government was not. They rebelled against the king's servants in the king's name. But over time, that distinction became harder to maintain. If abuse continued for generations, perhaps the problem was not only the official. Perhaps the structure itself was the enemy. Before that conclusion spread, the empire would pass through its darkest European century. The 17th century brought war, plague, bad harvests, bankruptcy, revolt, and a slow change in the balance of global power. Spain still possessed immense territories. Its armies were still feared. Its culture still flourished. But beneath the ceremony, the foundations were weakening. And the next crisis would not come from one battlefield. It would come from everywhere at once. The Spanish monarchy entered the 17th century still wearing the armor of a giant. Its soldiers had built a reputation for discipline and endurance. The tercios, infantry formations combining pikemen and firearms, had dominated European battlefields for generations. Spanish and Italian veterans marched through mud, snow, and hunger with a professionalism admired even by their enemies. The empire controlled strategic ports, islands, fortresses, and trade routes. Silver still crossed the Atlantic. Royal ceremonies still declared order. Yet the monarchy's strength had become increasingly expensive to display. Philip III inherited the throne in 1598. Unlike his father, he allowed a favorite, the Duke of Lerma, to dominate government. This system of rule through royal favorites, known as validos, would continue under later kings. It did not automatically mean government stopped functioning. The monarchy was too complex for one king to manage alone. But favorites concentrated access, patronage, and resentment. Office could be sold. Influence could become wealth. Court politics consumed attention while structural problems deepened. For a time, peace offered relief. Spain made peace with England in 1604. A truce with the Dutch began in 1609. The monarchy had a chance to recover. But that same year, the crown ordered the expulsion of the Moriscos. These were descendants of Muslims who had been forced or pressured to convert to Christianity. They had lived under suspicion for generations. Authorities accused them of secret Islamic practice, disloyalty, and possible cooperation with foreign enemies. Between 1609 and 1614, hundreds of thousands were forced to leave Spain. Families abandoned homes, farms, workshops, and villages. Some were attacked on the journey. Many reached North Africa as refugees in lands their ancestors had never seen. The expulsion was presented as religious purification and security. It also damaged local economies, especially in areas where Morisco labor and agriculture were important. Spain again tried to solve diversity by removing people. The human cost was enormous. The political reward was temporary. Then Europe descended into the 30 Years' War. What began in 1618 as a conflict within the Holy Roman Empire grew into a continental struggle involving religion, dynasty, territory, and the balance of power. Spain entered to support the Austrian Habsburgs, defend the route to the Netherlands, and preserve its strategic position. At first, Spanish arms achieved impressive victories, but war expanded. The Dutch conflict resumed. France, though Catholic, entered against the Habsburgs. Once again, religion could not contain strategy. The monarchy was fighting in the Low Countries, Germany, Italy, the Atlantic, and the Mediterranean while defending the Americas and Asia. No amount of silver could make every front safe. Under Philip IV, the Count Duke of Olivares attempted ambitious reform. He believed the monarchy's burdens fell too heavily on Castile. He wanted other kingdoms to contribute more soldiers and money. The idea had logic. The empire was shared. Why should one part carry so much of the cost? But the monarchy was not a centralized nation-state. Its territories guarded separate laws and privileges. To them, reform looked like Castilian domination. Olivares tried to strengthen the whole and nearly broke it apart. In 1640, rebellion exploded in Catalonia. War with France had brought troops, taxes, requisitions, and resentment into the region. Violence spread. Catalan leaders accepted French protection for a time. In the same year, Portugal revolted. Portuguese elites had grown angry over taxation, trade losses, and the cost of being tied to Spain's enemies. The Duke of Braganza was proclaimed King João IV. Spain now faced simultaneous rebellions at opposite sides of the peninsula while already fighting across Europe. Portugal would never return to Habsburg rule. The Union of Crowns was over. With Portugal went the appearance of a single monarchy spanning nearly every major oceanic route. The Dutch had already attacked Portuguese possessions in Brazil, Africa, and Asia during the Union. Now Portugal fought for independence while defending its own empire. Spain had reached too far. The center could no longer hold every crown together. In 1643, at Rocroi in northern France, a French army defeated Spanish forces in a battle later treated as the symbolic end of Spanish military supremacy. The reality was more gradual. Spanish troops continued to fight effectively after Rocroi. Empires do not lose centuries of experience in one afternoon. But symbols matter. The tercios had once seemed unstoppable. Now Europe had seen them broken. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 ended much of the 30 Years' War and recognized the independence of the Dutch Republic. Spain continued fighting France until 1659. The Treaty of the Pyrenees confirmed territorial losses and France's rising power. The direction of Europe was changing. Spain was no longer the uncontested center. France under Louis XIV would dominate the later 17th century. England and the Dutch Republic built expanding commercial and naval systems. Their merchants, banks, shipyards, and joint stock companies created new ways to mobilize capital. Spain still possessed more American territory than any rival. But territory alone did not guarantee economic leadership. The monarchy struggled with population decline in parts of Castile, tax pressure, weak agricultural productivity, repeated coinage problems, and dependence on imported manufactured goods. American silver had enriched individuals and financed power. It had not automatically created balanced development. Inflows of precious metal contributed to rising prices across Europe during the 16th century. For people whose incomes did not rise equally, daily life became harder. The crown taxed production and consumption while privileging some elites and institutions. Nobility carried honor. Manual labor could be socially disdained. Many sought office, land, or status rather than investment in productive enterprise. But it would be too simple to say silver made Spain lazy. Spanish merchants, farmers, artisans, sailors, and entrepreneurs remained active. Regional economies differed. The deeper problem was that imperial revenues were repeatedly consumed by war and debt before they could transform the country. Silver arrived already promised. It entered Seville and flowed toward creditors, suppliers, and armies. The empire was rich. The monarchy was often short of cash. Meanwhile, enemies learned to enter Spanish trade rather than merely attack it. Foreign merchants supplied goods legally through Spanish partners or illegally through smuggling. Colonists wanted products the official fleet system could not provide cheaply or regularly. Dutch, English, French, and Portuguese traders appeared along remote coasts. They exchanged textiles, weapons, food, and enslaved people for silver, hides, sugar, tobacco, and cacao. Local officials sometimes accepted the trade because their communities needed it. The crown condemned smuggling while its own restrictions helped create it. Pirates and privateers added terror to commerce. The Caribbean became a contested sea filled with fortified ports and vulnerable settlements. English forces seized Jamaica in 1655. The island became a major English base. French settlement expanded on the western side of Hispaniola, eventually developing into Saint-Domingue, the richest plantation colony in the Caribbean and one of the most brutal slave societies in history. Dutch islands became centers of trade and contraband. Spain still held the great mainland empires, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and strategic routes. But it no longer controlled the Caribbean alone. Fortification became essential. Havana, Cartagena de Indias, San Juan, Veracruz, Portobello, and other ports developed walls, bastions, batteries, and castles. Engineers designed defenses according to the latest military science. Stone absorbed royal wealth. Garrisons waited in heat and disease for attacks that might come once in a generation or tomorrow morning. The fortresses looked permanent. The sea remained open. The empire's survival depended on ordinary people who rarely appear in stories of kings. Dockworkers unloaded cargo. Shipwrights repaired hulls. Muleteers moved silver. Farmers fed cities. Militia members defended coasts. Indigenous communities maintained roads and produced tribute. Women extended credit and managed households during long absences. Free black and mixed-race militias became especially important in Caribbean defense. These men served a monarchy that ranked them beneath white elites, yet the monarchy needed their weapons when foreign fleets appeared. Military service could bring status, exemptions, and community pride. It could also expose the contradiction between racial hierarchy and imperial necessity. The empire endured because millions of people carried it through daily routines. Not because Madrid controlled every detail. Not because Spanish fleets never lost. Not because rebellion disappeared. It endured because local societies had developed interests tied to imperial order. Merchants wanted protected trade. Officials wanted office. Clergy wanted institutions. Elites wanted land and rank. Some indigenous nobles wanted recognized authority. Militia officers wanted privilege. Communities wanted legal confirmation of property. The monarchy could fail many of them and still remain useful enough to survive. But usefulness has limits. By the end of the 17th century, Spain faced a dynastic crisis that threatened not merely a colony or province, but the entire European balance of power. King Charles II had no surviving child. He had inherited a body weakened by generations of close Habsburg marriage. His health was poor. His court was divided. European powers waited for his death because the question of who would inherit Spain also meant who might control its empire. The Spanish monarchy still possessed the Americas, the Philippines, Mediterranean territories, and strategic ports. Even in weakness, it was a prize large enough to cause a world war. Charles II died in 1700. His will named Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, as heir. Philip became Philip V of Spain, the first Bourbon king. But Austria supported a Habsburg claimant. England and the Dutch feared that France and Spain might unite into an overwhelming Bourbon bloc. The War of the Spanish Succession began. Fighting spread across Europe and overseas. Inside Spain, the war became a civil conflict between territories supporting rival claimants. Castile largely backed Philip. Much of the crown of Aragon supported the Austrian side. Cities were besieged. Armies crossed the peninsula. Barcelona resisted until 1714. Philip V kept the throne, but the peace settlement reshaped the empire. Spain lost many European possessions. The Austrian Habsburgs received the Spanish Netherlands and territories in Italy. Britain gained Gibraltar and Minorca and secured valuable commercial privileges, including access connected to supplying enslaved Africans to Spanish America. Spain remained an imperial power, but its center of gravity shifted more clearly toward the Atlantic world. The new Bourbon dynasty also changed the internal structure of Spain. Philip used decrees to abolish many separate institutions and privileges in territories that had opposed him, particularly in the Crown of Aragon. Government became more centralized along Castilian lines. This was not yet a modern uniform state. Navarre and the Basque provinces retained important privileges. But the direction was clear. The Bourbons wanted a monarchy that could command resources more efficiently. They had watched the Habsburg system bend until it almost broke. Now they would try to tighten it. The 18th century is often described as a period of Spanish decline. That is only half true. Spain had lost European dominance, but the empire recovered in significant ways. Population increased. Trade expanded. Naval construction improved. Administrative reforms raised revenue. Colonial cities grew. Mining production revived. The crown created new viceroyalties, including New Granada and Rio de la Plata, to improve defense and government. New captaincies generally strengthened strategic regions. Intendants were introduced to oversee taxation and administration. The fleet system was gradually loosened, and commerce opened among more ports. The Bourbons wanted colonies that produced more, paid more, and obeyed more. Reforms strengthened the empire. It also made imperial pressure more visible. Officials inspected institutions. Monopolies expanded over goods such as tobacco. Taxes were collected more aggressively. American-born elites saw peninsular officials receive powerful appointments. Local arrangements that had survived through custom came under attack from centralized rules. The crown believed it was modernizing. Many subjects believed it was taking away rights. This is one of history's recurring patterns. A government reforms to save itself. The reforms produce resistance that helps destroy it. Under Charles III, who ruled from 1759 to 1788, the reform program intensified. Charles is often remembered as an enlightened monarch. He promoted public works, education, science, urban improvement, and economic change. Madrid gained new avenues, buildings, lighting, and institutions. Scientific expeditions studied plants, animals, geography, and resources across the empire. Maps became more precise. Officials collected information with a new hunger. The state wanted to see everything. Forest mines, ports, populations, taxes. Knowledge itself became a form of rule. But enlightened monarchy was still monarchy. The crown did not ask its subjects to govern themselves. It wanted them better organized beneath royal authority. In 1767, Charles III expelled the Jesuits from Spanish territories. The Society of Jesus had built schools, missions, estates, and networks of influence. Jesuits advised elites and educated generations of American-born students. The crown suspected their independence and loyalty to the Pope. Their sudden removal shocked communities across the empire. American Jesuits went into exile, and some began writing histories that praised the lands of their birth. In trying to weaken a religious order, the monarchy helped produce a literature of American identity. The empire was teaching its colonial elites to imagine themselves apart from Spain. Urban military reforms also expanded local militias. The goal was practical. Britain had demonstrated the danger of weak colonial defense during the 7 Years' War. In 1762, British forces captured Havana and Manila. Both cities were returned after the war, but the humiliation was severe. If the empire could lose its Caribbean key and its Asian capital, nowhere was safe. Spain strengthened fortifications, reorganized troops, and armed more colonial subjects. Criollo officers gained military experience and status. Men who would later challenge imperial rule learned to command in units created to defend it. Spain also supported Britain's rebellious North American colonies during the American Revolution. The decision was driven by rivalry with Britain, not devotion to republican liberty. Spanish officials feared revolutionary ideas spreading into their own territories, but they saw a chance to recover lost ground. Spain entered the war in 1779 as an ally of France. Bernardo de Galvez, governor of Spanish Louisiana, led campaigns that captured British positions along the lower Mississippi and Gulf Coast, including Baton Rouge, Mobile, and Pensacola. Spanish arms and supplies helped the American cause. At the peace, Spain regained Florida. Yet the new United States created another long-term challenge. A republic now stood on the edge of Spanish North America. Its population was growing. Its settlers looked west. Its leaders spoke of liberty while many held people in slavery. Spain had helped weaken Britain. It had also helped create a future rival. Across the empire, 18th-century growth produced new wealth and new anger. Mining expanded in Mexico. Cuba's economy grew. Buenos Aires benefited from legal trade. Venezuela exported cacao. Merchants built fortunes. Universities and printing presses spread ideas. American-born elites read Enlightenment works, followed revolutions abroad, and developed pride in local history. They did not all seek independence. Many wanted greater access to office and freer commerce within the monarchy. But every exclusion sharpened the difference between being Spanish and being American. The most explosive warning came from the Andes. In 1780, José Gabriel Condorcanqui, an indigenous noble who took the name Tupac Amaru II, seized a colonial official notorious for abuse. The official was executed. The uprising spread through southern Peru and into the highlands of present-day Bolivia. Tupac Amaru condemned forced labor, corrupt officials, and oppressive taxes. He initially claimed loyalty to the king while attacking the colonial system. He called for broad support and at points declared freedom for enslaved people who joined his cause. But the rebellion contained deep tensions among indigenous communities, mestizos, criollos, and others. Violence escalated on all sides. The rebels besieged Cusco but failed to capture it. Tupac Amaru was betrayed, captured, and brought to the city. Spanish authorities executed him in 1781 with deliberate brutality, attempting to tear his body apart before killing and dismembering him. His family and allies were also punished. The rebellion continued after his death and was eventually crushed. The crown had won, but fear spread through colonial elites. The revolt had mobilized tens of thousands and invoked the memory of Inca sovereignty. It showed that centuries of Spanish rule had not erased older political identities. It also showed the difficulty of building a united rebellion in a society divided by race, class, region, and historical grievance. The authorities responded with repression, limiting symbols, clothing, language, and traditions associated with the Inca past. They tried to control memory. But memory does not disappear because a government forbids it. The empire entered the final years of the 18th century stronger than it had been a century earlier in many measurable ways. Revenue was higher. Trade was larger. Defenses were improved. Administration was more active. And yet the bond between crown and colony was weaker. The monarchy demanded more from people who increasingly believed they deserved more in return. Then revolution erupted in the Atlantic world. The United States had broken from Britain. France overthrew its monarchy. Enslaved people in Saint-Domingue rose against one of the richest colonial regimes on earth and created Haiti. Kings were executed. Rights were declared. Empires trembled. Spain tried to contain these ideas. But ideas cross borders more easily than armies. The final destruction would not begin in Mexico, Peru, or Venezuela. It would begin in Spain itself. And it would begin with an emperor from France marching across the peninsula as if the Spanish crown no longer mattered. At the beginning of the 19th century, Spain was allied with revolutionary France and then with Napoleon Bonaparte's empire. The alliance pulled Spanish ships into war against Britain. In 1805, at the Battle of Trafalgar, a British fleet under Admiral Horatio Nelson defeated the combined French and Spanish fleet off the coast of Spain. Nelson died in the battle, but Britain secured naval dominance. For Spain, the defeat weakened the fleet that connected and defended the empire. The Atlantic did not become impossible to cross, but the balance of power at sea had shifted decisively. Napoleon looked at Spain and saw weakness. The royal court was divided between King Charles IV, Queen Maria Luisa, the powerful minister Manuel Godoy, and the king's son Ferdinand. Public anger grew over military failures, economic hardship, and Godoy's influence. In 1807, Spain allowed French troops to cross its territory for an invasion of Portugal. The French entered as allies. They did not leave as allies. French forces occupied strategic positions. The Spanish royal family fell into crisis. An uprising at Aranjuez forced Charles IV to abdicate in favor of Ferdinand VII. Napoleon summoned father and son to Bayonne. There, under pressure, both surrendered their claims. Napoleon placed his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne. The monarchy that had claimed authority across half the world had been taken apart in a foreign city. No great invasion fleet had crossed the Atlantic. No colonial army had captured Madrid. The empire's crisis began with a question no council could answer. Who was the legitimate king? On May 2, 1808, people in Madrid rose against French troops. The uprising was crushed with executions, later immortalized by Francisco Goya. In his paintings, there is no clean glory. There are terrified faces, anonymous victims, rifles, blood, and darkness. The war that followed became the Peninsular War. Spanish soldiers, local militias, guerrilla fighters, Portuguese forces, and a British army under Arthur Wellesley fought the French occupation. The word guerrilla, meaning little war, entered international language from this conflict. French armies could capture cities. They struggled to control the countryside. Every road became dangerous. Every village could hide fighters. Reprisals created more resistance. The occupation drained Napoleon's empire and became one of the great wounds in his European system. But for Spanish America, the most important fact was the absence of an undisputed monarch. Political authority in the empire had always flowed from the king. If the king was captive, who possessed sovereignty? Spanish provinces formed juntas claiming to govern in Ferdinand's name. American cities did the same. At first, many did not demand complete independence. They demanded the right to govern until the legitimate king returned. But beneath that loyal language lay a revolutionary principle. If sovereignty returned to the people when the monarch was absent, then American communities might possess authority equal to communities in Spain. The imperial hierarchy began to crack through legal argument. In Cortés, one of the few major Spanish cities not controlled by France, representatives gathered to create a national government and constitution. The Constitution of 1812 declared national sovereignty and established a constitutional monarchy. It attempted to define Spaniards on both sides of the Atlantic as members of one political nation. For liberals, it was a historic breakthrough. For many Americans, representation remained unequal and the transformation incomplete. For conservatives, the document went too far. The Constitution carried the promise of a different Spanish world. War and reaction would destroy that promise. Across Spanish America, local conflicts widened. These wars were not simply colonies fighting Spaniards from Europe. They were civil wars within American societies. American-born royalists fought for the crown. Peninsular Spaniards joined independence movements. Indigenous communities chose different sides according to local interests. Enslaved and free black people fought for promises of freedom, status, or survival. Llanero horsemen, Urban militias, rural villagers, elite officers, priests, merchants, and landowners entered a struggle whose meaning changed over time. Families divided. Regions fought regions. Revolution was not one wave moving neatly from north to south. It was years of defeat, return, terror, negotiation, and exhaustion. In New Spain, the crisis became open rebellion in 1810. Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla, a priest in the town of Dolores, called his followers to rise. The event became known as the Grito de Dolores. Hidalgo's movement grew with astonishing speed. Indigenous and mixed-race peasants joined by the tens of thousands. They carried religious images, improvised weapons, and accumulated anger. The army captured towns and threatened Mexico City. But the movement lacked discipline and a unified political program. Violence against Spaniards and property frightened many elites who might otherwise have supported reform. Hidalgo hesitated before the capital. Royalist forces regrouped. He was captured and executed in 1811. His head was displayed as a warning. The warning failed. Another priest, José María Morelos, continued the struggle. Morelos was a more disciplined commander and political thinker. He called for independence, an end to caste distinctions, and the abolition of slavery. His forces controlled large areas and convened a congress. But he too was captured and executed in 1815. The rebellion fragmented into regional guerrilla war. Spain seemed to be winning. Yet the war had changed New Spain permanently. The crown could suppress leaders. It could not restore the world that existed before 1810. In northern South America, the struggle became associated above all with Simón Bolívar. Born into a wealthy Criollo family in Caracas, Bolívar entered revolution with privilege, education, ambition, and a belief that Spanish rule had to end. His path was not a straight march to victory. Early Venezuelan republics collapsed. Earthquake, royalist resistance, racial conflict, military weakness, and internal division destroyed revolutionary governments. Bolívar fled more than once. He wrote, recruited, returned, and lost again. The man later called the liberator spent years close to failure. Venezuela's war became especially savage. Royalist forces mobilized llaneros, skilled horsemen from the plains, many of whom distrusted Criollo elites. The conflict blurred into social vengeance. Atrocities answered atrocities. Bolívar eventually understood that independence could not succeed as a movement only for wealthy American-born whites. He promised freedom to enslaved people who joined. He sought support from Haiti, the Black Republic created by a successful slave revolution. Haitian President Alexander Pétion provided assistance on the condition that Bolívar moved toward emancipation. The revolution of enslaved people that terrified colonial elites also helped liberate Spanish America. Bolívar rebuilt his movement. In 1819, he led forces across flooded plains and over the Andes in a campaign that seemed impossible. Men climbed through cold and altitude with inadequate clothing. Horses died. Soldiers collapsed. The Royalists did not expect an army to come through the mountains. That was why Bolívar chose the route. At the Battle of Boyaca, his forces secured New Granada. The victory gave the revolution territory, resources, and momentum. The Republic of Colombia, later called Gran Colombia, united present-day Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Panama under an ambitious political project. But unity born in war would struggle in peace. To the south, another liberating movement rose from the Rio de la Plata. José de San Martín, a professional officer who had served in the Spanish army, became one of the leading commanders of independence. He understood that royalist power in Peru could not be defeated by repeated attacks through Upper Peru alone. He proposed a different route. Cross the Andes, liberate Chile, build a fleet, attack Peru from the Pacific. The crossing of the Andes in 1817 became one of the great military feats of the era. San Martín organized separate columns, supplies, animals, artillery, intelligence, and deception across some of the world's most difficult terrain. His army defeated royalists at Chacabuco. After a setback, victory at Maipú secured Chilean independence. With Chilean leader Bernardo O'Higgins and a navy commanded in part by the daring British officer Thomas Cochrane, the revolution carried war northward by sea. San Martín entered Lima and proclaimed Peruvian independence in 1821. But royalist armies still controlled the highlands. The final outcome remained uncertain. In 1822, San Martin met Bolívar at Guayaquil. No complete record explains everything they discussed. The meeting became one of the great mysteries of the independence era. Two liberators entered. Only one would continue the Continental campaign. San Martin withdrew from public leadership and eventually left South America. Bolívar took command of the final struggle in Peru. His lieutenant Antonio José de Sucre won the decisive Battle of Ayacucho in 1824. The Royalist army was defeated. Spanish rule over the South American mainland was effectively broken. Upper Peru became Bolivia, named for Bolívar. The empire that had begun with the capture of Atahualpa ended in the Andes almost 3 centuries later. But the wars did not produce one united Spanish-American nation. Bolívar dreamed of continental unity. Regional interests, geography, personal rivalries, economic differences, and political distrust tore Gran Colombia apart. New states emerged with borders shaped partly by colonial administrative divisions. Independence removed Spanish officials. It did not remove inequality. Indigenous tribute might be abolished and later replaced by other burdens. Slavery survived in several new republics for decades. Land remained concentrated. Military leaders entered politics. Civil wars followed wars of liberation. The promise of citizenship collided with societies built through hierarchy. History remembers the liberation. It must also remember the unfinished revolution. Mexico's path took a final, unexpected turn. By 1820, Royalist forces had contained much of the insurgency. Then a liberal revolution in Spain restored the Constitution of 1812 and threatened the privileges of conservative elites and the church. Some of the people who had defended royal rule now feared liberal Spain more than independence. Agustin de Iturbide, a royalist officer, negotiated with insurgent leader Vicente Guerrero. Their plan of Iguala promised 3 guarantees: religion, independence, and union between Spaniards and Americans. The coalition succeeded. Mexico became independent in 1821. Iturbide crowned himself emperor. His empire quickly collapsed. A republic followed. The war that began with a mass uprising from below ended through an alliance that protected many interests from above. Yet Hidalgo, Morelos, Guerrero, indigenous villagers, mixed-race fighters, women couriers, and countless unnamed participants had made return to the old order impossible. Central America also broke from Spain and passed briefly into the Mexican Empire before forming its own federation. The federation later divided into separate republics. Across the continent, the imperial structure dissolved faster than almost anyone had imagined. In 1808, Spain ruled most of the Americas south and west of the United States, except Brazil and several European colonies. By the mid-1820s, nearly all of its mainland empire was gone. The loss was not caused by one battle. It came from a chain reaction. Napoleon destroyed the legitimacy of the crown. Local juntas created new political authority. Repression turned reformers into separatists. War militarized society. Racial and class tensions widened conflict. British merchants and naval power weakened Spanish control. Haiti supported revolution. Leaders such as Bolívar, San Martin, Sucre, Hidalgo, Morelos, Guerrero, O'Higgins, and many others gave the movement's direction. Ordinary people gave them armies. And Ferdinand VII gave the empire almost no path back. When Ferdinand returned to Spain in 1814 after Napoleon's defeat, he abolished the liberal constitution and restored absolutism. Many subjects who had fought in his name watched him destroy the political promises made during his captivity. Spain sent expeditions to recover control, but it lacked the money, ships, unity, and manpower to reverse revolution across a hemisphere. In 1820, troops assembled for another American campaign rebelled in Spain and demanded restoration of the Constitution. The empire had reached a final irony. The army intended to save the colonies helped trigger a revolution at home. Ferdinand was forced to accept constitutional government, then restored to absolute power with French intervention in 1823. Spain's own struggle between liberalism and absolutism would dominate much of the 19th century. Civil conflict, military coups, dynastic disputes, and political instability consumed the country. The monarchy that had once intervened across Europe now struggled to govern itself. Still, the Spanish Empire was not finished. Cuba remained. Puerto Rico remained. The Philippines remained. Guam and other Pacific islands remained. Spain also held or later expanded territories in Africa. The continental empire had shattered. An island empire survived. And on those islands, the forces of sugar, slavery, reform, nationalism, and foreign ambition were gathering for one last collision. Of all Spain's remaining colonies, Cuba became the most important. The island guarded the entrance to the Gulf of Mexico and sat across the sea routes between the Atlantic and the Caribbean. Havana was a naval station, shipbuilding center, commercial port, and fortified gateway. For centuries, treasure fleets gathered in its harbor before beginning the return to Europe. After the loss of mainland Spanish America, Cuba became even more valuable. It was no longer one possession among many. It was the heart of what remained. The 19th century Cuban economy expanded through sugar. Steam power, railways, mills, foreign credit, and access to international markets transformed production. But the expansion rested on slavery. Even as abolition spread elsewhere in the Atlantic world, enslaved Africans continued to be carried illegally to Cuba in large numbers after the transatlantic trade had been officially restricted. Plantations demanded labor. Merchants demanded profit. Officials could be bribed. Human beings disappeared into an economy that treated suffering as a cost of production. Cuban planters grew wealthy. Havana developed theaters, mansions, newspapers, shops, and modern infrastructure. Behind that prosperity stood the plantation barracks, the whip, family separation, and the constant fear of rebellion. The Haitian Revolution haunted Cuba. Saint-Domingue had once been the richest sugar colony in the world. Then enslaved people rose, defeated armies, abolished slavery, and created Haiti. For Cuban elites, Haiti was both warning and opportunity. The destruction of Saint-Domingue's plantation economy opened markets for Cuban sugar, but it also proved that enslaved people could destroy the system built upon them. Many wealthy Cubans therefore feared independence if it meant social revolution. They disliked Spanish restrictions but relied on Spanish troops to protect slavery and property. This delayed the independence movement. It did not eliminate it. Puerto Rico followed a different but connected path. Its economy expanded through sugar, coffee, tobacco, and trade. Slavery existed there too, though on a different scale from Cuba. Reformers demanded political rights and an end to colonial restrictions. In 1868, the Grito de Lares challenged Spanish rule, but the uprising was quickly suppressed. Slavery was abolished in Puerto Rico in 1873, though systems of coerced transition limited immediate freedom. The island remained under Spanish control until the final war. In Cuba, the first great independence struggle began in 1868 with the Grito de Yara. Carlos Manuel de Céspedes, a landowner, declared independence and freed enslaved people under his control, calling them to join the rebellion. The 10 Years' War followed. Eastern Cuba became the center of insurgency. Rebel forces, including many free and formerly enslaved black Cubans, fought for independence and emancipation. Spanish troops and loyalist militias fought to preserve the empire. The war was destructive and bitter. Plantations burned. Towns suffered. Disease killed soldiers on both sides. Divisions among the rebels weakened the movement. The conflict ended in 1878 without independence, though promises of reform followed. Slavery in Cuba was finally abolished in 1886. But the political question remained. Could Cuba gain meaningful autonomy within Spain? Or had generations of war made separation inevitable? José Martí became the moral and intellectual voice of the final independence movement. A poet, writer, organizer, and exile, Martí saw Cuban freedom as part of a larger struggle against both Spanish colonialism and the danger of domination by the United States. He wanted a republic that crossed racial lines and avoided the hatreds that could destroy the nation after victory. He helped organize a new war in 1895. Martí returned to Cuba and was killed early in the fighting at Dos Rios. His death transformed him into a martyr. Others continued the war, including experienced commanders Máximo Gómez and Antonio Maceo. Maceo, the Bronze Titan, was a black Cuban general whose military skill and refusal to accept incomplete peace made him one of the revolution's greatest figures. Rebel armies used mobility and destruction of economic resources to make Spanish control impossible. Spain responded with massive military force. General Valeriano Weyler introduced a policy of reconcentration, forcing rural civilians into controlled areas in an attempt to separate them from insurgents. The result was humanitarian disaster. Food shortages, disease, overcrowding, and inadequate shelter killed large numbers of civilians. Images and reports of suffering spread abroad. In the United States, newspapers published dramatic stories about Spanish cruelty. Some reports were accurate. Others were exaggerated or shaped by sensational competition. Public sympathy for Cuba mixed with strategic ambition, commercial interest, and a growing belief among some American leaders that the United States should become an overseas power. Then, in February 1898, the American battleship USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor. The cause was not understood at the time, and later investigations have produced different interpretations, with an internal explosion widely considered possible. But in the political atmosphere of 1898, uncertainty became accusation. American newspapers blamed Spain. Calls for war intensified. The United States demanded Spanish withdrawal from Cuba. War began in April. Spain now faced a younger industrial power with greater resources and a modern navy. The conflict would be decided with shocking speed. The first major blow came not in Cuba, but on the other side of the world. In Manila Bay, Commodore George Dewey's American squadron attacked the Spanish Pacific Fleet on May 1, 1898. The Spanish ships were outgunned and defeated. The battle exposed the vulnerability of an empire stretched across oceans it could no longer command. But the Philippines had already been in revolution before the Americans arrived. Spanish rule in the archipelago had changed deeply during the 19th century. The end of the Manila Galleon trade, expansion of global commerce, growth of export agriculture, opening of ports, and development of an educated Filipino class transformed society. Reform-minded Filipinos known as ilustrados called for representation, equality before the law, secularization of parishes, and an end to abuses. Among them was José Rizal. Rizal was a physician, novelist, and intellectual whose books exposed corruption, racial arrogance, and the power of religious orders in colonial life. He did not begin as an advocate of violent revolution, but Spanish authorities viewed reform itself as dangerous. Rizal was arrested, tried, and executed by firing squad in Manila in December 1896. His death strengthened the revolution he had hoped to guide through reason. The Katipunan, a secret revolutionary society, had already launched an uprising in 1896. Leaders such as Andrés Bonifacio mobilized resistance. Internal conflict later divided the movement. Emilio Aguinaldo emerged as a leading commander. By 1898, Filipino revolutionaries had weakened Spanish control across much of the archipelago. Aguinaldo returned from exile with American assistance and declared Philippine independence in June. Filipino forces surrounded Manila. Yet when the Spanish surrendered the city in August, American troops controlled the transfer. The revolutionaries who had fought for independence were kept outside the final arrangement. One empire was leaving, another was arriving. In Cuba, American and Cuban forces campaigned against Spanish positions. Fighting around Santiago included battles later celebrated in American memory, especially the charge associated with Theodore Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. But Cuban insurgents had fought for years before American intervention and provided crucial intelligence, pressure, and military support. The Spanish Caribbean fleet attempted to escape Santiago Harbor in July and was destroyed. Spain asked for peace. The war had lasted only a few months. The peace settlement ended centuries of Spanish rule across key territories. Spain relinquished its claim to Cuba. It ceded Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. The United States paid Spain $20 million in connection with the transfer of the Philippines. Cuba did not become fully free from foreign influence. The United States occupied the island and later imposed conditions that allowed intervention in Cuban affairs. Puerto Rico and Guam became American possessions. Filipino nationalists who expected independence discovered that the United States intended to govern the islands. War broke out between American forces and the Philippine Republic in 1899. The struggle was brutal. The end of Spanish Empire did not mean the end of empire. It meant imperial power had changed hands. For Spain, 1898 became known as the disaster. The defeat produced shock, mourning, anger, and national self-examination. Writers and intellectuals asked what had gone wrong. How had the monarchy that once ruled across the Atlantic and Pacific lost its final great colonies to a republic that had not existed when Spain's empire was already centuries old? Some blamed political corruption. Some blamed military weakness. Some romanticized the lost empire. Others saw defeat as a chance to rebuild Spain itself. But even after 1898, Spain retained smaller colonial territories in Africa. Spanish influence in northern Morocco expanded through protectorate arrangements in the 20th century. Spain controlled Equatorial Guinea until 1968. It held Spanish Sahara until 1975, when Spain withdrew during the final illness of Francisco Franco, leaving a conflict over Western Sahara that remains unresolved. By then, the old imperial system of viceroys, treasure fleets, and oceanic galleons had long vanished. Yet the colonial habit of drawing borders and transferring authority without the consent of local populations had not disappeared. The official end of empire is rarely the end of its consequences. So what was the Spanish Empire? Was it the triumph of navigation, courage, and statecraft? It produced voyages that connected oceans. It built cities, universities, roads, ports, archives, cathedrals, hospitals, and legal institutions across enormous distances. It carried crops and animals that transformed diets and landscapes. It created enduring cultural worlds in which European, indigenous, African, and Asian traditions met. The Spanish language spread across continents and became one of the most widely spoken languages on Earth. Catholicism took root from California to Patagonia and across the Philippines, transformed by the societies that received it. Art, music, food, architecture, law, and family life developed forms that did not exist before the encounter. Those are real legacies. But empire was also conquest. It seized land through claims indigenous peoples had never accepted. It destroyed political orders. It profited from forced labor. It participated in the Atlantic slave trade. It demanded tribute. It punished religious traditions. It moved communities, separated families, and created racial hierarchies whose effects survived independence. Those legacies are also real. The story becomes false when one side is used to erase the other. The empire was neither a simple machine of darkness nor a heroic civilization bringing order to an empty world. There was no empty world. The Americas and the Philippines contained complex societies before Spain arrived. And Spanish rule was never the work of Spaniards alone. Indigenous allies helped conquer rival states. Indigenous labor sustained towns and mines. African labor built economies. Asian merchants connected Manila to global trade. Mixed communities created colonial culture. Local officials interpreted royal commands. Subjects resisted, negotiated, adapted, and survived. The empire belonged to the crown. Its history belongs to everyone who lived beneath it. Even the word Spain can mislead when projected backward. The monarchy that began expansion under Ferdinand and Isabella was a union of crowns, not a fully unified nation in the modern sense. The Habsburgs ruled a collection of kingdoms. The Bourbons centralized parts of that collection. The empire changed across 4 centuries. The Caribbean world of Columbus was not the Mexican world of Cortés. The monarchy of Charles V was not the monarchy of Charles III. Cuba in 1898 was not Peru in 1532. To speak of one Spanish empire is useful. To imagine it remained the same is not. Its greatest strength was adaptation. When conquest ended, administration expanded. When local systems could not be destroyed, they were incorporated. When fleets failed, merchants smuggled. When Habsburg government weakened, Bourbon reform tightened control. When mainland colonies broke away, the empire turned toward islands. But adaptation also created the contradictions that destroyed it. The crown recognized indigenous subjects while exploiting indigenous labor. It wrote protective laws while rewarding those who ignored them. It defended Catholic unity while relying on violence, slavery, and foreign finance. It imported silver on a massive scale while falling into repeated debt. It armed colonial militias that later fought for independence. It educated American and Filipino elites who learned to criticize imperial rule. It demanded loyalty while denying equal access to power. It wanted its colonies to become more productive, but not more autonomous. It wanted reform without surrendering control. By the time the monarchy understood that these goals could not all coexist, it was too late. Perhaps the most important legacy of the Spanish Empire is not a border, language, church, or ruined fortress. It is connection. Before the 16th century, the peoples of the Americas had no regular contact with Europe, Africa, or Asia across the oceans. Afterward, no region could remain isolated from the others. Silver from Bolivia altered markets in China. Diseases from Eurasia devastated American communities. American maize and potatoes supported population growth far beyond the Atlantic. African peoples carried against their will transformed music, religion, language, agriculture, and society in the Americas. Asian goods changed taste in Mexico and Europe. European animals changed warfare and mobility across indigenous lands. The world became connected through unequal power. That is the beginning of modern global history. And Spain stood at its center. But standing at the center did not mean controlling the result. The monarchy wanted silver to strengthen the crown. The silver strengthened foreign creditors and global markets. It wanted Christianity to unify its subjects. Local peoples remade Christianity in their own image. It wanted cities to display Spanish order. The cities became mixed societies with identities of their own. It wanted colonial elites to defend empire. Those elites eventually led revolutions against it. It wanted Manila to open Asia to Spanish power. Manila became dependent on Chinese trade and Mexican silver. The empire built connections it could never fully command. Return now to the summer of 1588. The Armada is scattered in the Northern Sea. A captain stands on a damaged deck and looks west through rain. He does not know whether his ship will survive the night. He cannot see Mexico, where indigenous communities are rebuilding life under colonial rule. He cannot see Potosí, where men are entering the Silver Mountain. He cannot see Manila, where merchants wait for a galleon from Acapulco. He cannot see soldiers marching in the Netherlands, enslaved Africans crossing the Atlantic, Mapuche warriors defending their frontier, or officials opening royal letters months after they were written. But all of them are connected to the storm around him. The ship carries taxes, orders, weapons, faith, ambition, and debt. If it sinks, merchants may fail. Soldiers may go unpaid. Families may never learn what happened. If it survives, the empire continues. Not as a perfect machine, as a fragile chain held together across impossible distances. That was the true Spanish Empire. Not a color on a map. Not one king's command. Not one story of heroes or villains. It was a struggle to turn oceans into roads and conquest into permanence. It was a world built by ambition and sustained by millions who carried burdens they had never chosen. It created wealth beyond imagination and suffering beyond calculation. It reached its greatest size and discovered that size was not the same as strength. It tried to rule the world and instead helped create a world that could no longer be ruled by one empire. History remembers Spanish galleons filled with silver, but the silver was never the empire's greatest treasure. Its greatest treasure was time. For more than 4 centuries, the monarchy survived storms, invasions, bankruptcies, rebellions, rival empires, and revolutions. It survived long enough to change languages, landscapes, religions, economies, and identities across the planet. Then the world it had connected began to move without it. The colonies became nations. The trade routes found new masters. The royal banners came down. But the empire did not vanish. It remained in the names of cities, in the shape of borders, in family histories, in churches built over temples, in African rhythms carried into American music, in indigenous languages that survived every campaign to erase them, in legal systems, land disputes, racial inequalities, festivals, recipes, paintings, and memories. The empire ended. The world it created did not. And that may be the final truth of every empire. Their armies eventually lose. Their flags eventually fall. But their consequences continue walking among the living. So when we ask whether the Spanish Empire was a story of glory or catastrophe, perhaps the answer is that it was both, experienced by different people at the same moment. For a king in Madrid, a silver fleet meant power. For a miner in Potosí, it could mean death beneath a mountain. For a missionary, conversion could mean salvation. For an indigenous family, it could mean the destruction of sacred tradition. For a merchant in Manila, empire created opportunity. For a Chinese community facing massacre, it created terror. For a Criollo officer, the crown offered status. For the same officer a generation later, the crown became an obstacle to independence. History becomes honest only when all of them remain in the frame. The Spanish Empire once believed the sun would never set on its dominions. In one sense, it was right. The political empire passed into darkness. But somewhere in the world it changed. The light of its legacy is always visible. The question is not whether that light is bright or dark. The question is whose eyes we are looking through. Was the Spanish Empire ultimately held together by faith, silver, and royal power? Or did it survive for so long because the people beneath it learned how to bend the empire to their own lives? The answer may decide whether we see this history as the rise and fall of Spain or as the violent birth of the modern world. Subscribe for more stories where the past is not simplified and where the people history tried to forget are brought back into the light.